Hi everyone, Demilich here. So, the second balance patch for the game has just been released, and in my opinion, it brings even more changes than the first one. Some of them are pretty controversial, some are actually good, and then there are a few that honestly make me wonder why they were added in the first place. But we will get to all of that in a moment. Since it looks like the balance patches are going to be released fairly often, I don't really see the point in making guides or a tier list right now. The meta is changing too quickly, and those videos would become outdated almost immediately. For the time being, I will mostly be covering new patches, stream some games, and maybe uploading a few interesting matches. I might even start reviewing replays from other players. We will see how that goes. Um, in this video, I will focus on what I consider to be the most important changes. Most of my perspective will naturally come from playing Necrons. Also, I've also started playing Dark Eldar quite a bit recently, so without further ado, let's get started. Starting with the chaos, the first change we see is morale break status reduced from 150 to 100 is already a pretty controversial and risky one. Most units in this faction have a morale break value around 150. They also have problems recovering morale, and that's how it was originally intended to work. In my opinion, this stat shouldn't have been touched at all. It's one of the things that makes chaos feel like a chaos, and changing it hurts the faction's balance. Now this value is just average like every other fraction, and I don't really see the point anymore. The second change was unexpected for me. Chaos vehicles now receive covers bonuses just like every other faction. That is that is clearly the right decision. The third change is the return of Defiler's area effect change. This is the second change that actually needed to happen. They probably realized it didn't work. The unit basically stopped being used, so they reverted it. It happens. We are all human. We all make mistakes and we fix them. That's perfectly fine. Um, the first change I'd like to talk about is what they did to the Demon Prince. Honestly, I don't understand at all why they decide to give him a 50% increased damage against relic units. Chaos already has three different units that fill this role. The faction has never had problem dealing damage to any unit type whatsoever, but now we have yet another anti-relic unit that is also effective against infantry. It's basically another Bloodthirster, except it's available in a tier 2. I honestly don't know who suggests this change, but it looks like someone just wanted to buff the Demon Prince because they personally didn't know who deal with relic units. So, after all these balance changes, of which only two were actually really necessary, the end result is pretty simple. The faction has become stronger and more overpowered than before. Now, let's move on to the Dark Eldar. In this patch, they got hit with some pretty significant nerfs. However, their early game wasn't weakened that much, so in most cases, you can still end the game in the tier 1. The Archon and his abilities were nerfed along with the reinforcement speed of his retinue, but The most painful change is, of course, the 20% damage reduction for the witches. Um, Maybe that change made sense overall. They can still perform well in the melee and continue providing their utilities such as slowing enemy units and speeding up friendly ones. I don't think people are going to stop using them because of this. Um, there are also some tier 3 buffs similar to what Necrons received. Most likely, the goal was to make a tier 1 army more capable of standing up to tier 3 units. Personally, I support that philosophy. I don't think it's good game design when a unit you build simply becomes irrelevant once the game reaches tier 3. There should be a way to upgrade and strengthen your existing army instead of having to replace it just because it's no longer effective. Overall, though, there's no question that the faction is weaker after this patch. At the same time, I wouldn't say it's the end of the world. But we will see about that. Eldars received a lot of very cautious nerfs, but they don't really address what makes this faction overpowered in the first place. Even though some of the changes were definitely good, as the developers themselves seem to realize the real problem is Dark Reapers and Rangers. Dark Reapers have so much movement speed that they can deal damage while taking virtually none in return. I know some of you will say, well, that requires good micro. That's true, but once you learn how to do it properly, you will erase enemy units with easy and constantly gain an advantage. I really hope the developers eventually recognize this. I think the best way to solve the Dark Reapers problem would be to give them a setup time before firing of 1 to 1.5 seconds. You could even restore their hit points to what they were before the patch to compensate um, against an experienced Eldar player. Your only real hope is to land a good teleport or play on the map where you can somehow trap their Reapers. Everything else simply doesn't work. Um, Then we see nerfs to several tier 3 and tier 4 units. Those changes made sense, and I'd say that's good work. Um, the problem is that this game is decided primarily by the early game because that's what determines how the rest of the match will play out. So these late game changes simply aren't going to have a major impact. Uh, as for the Brightlands platform and the Pathfinder team, honestly, their bonuses could have been reduced to around uh, 25, 30% instead. Uh, 50% is still too much. I can guarantee those units would still be used just as often as they are now. Now, let's talk about the Imperial Guard, or as people have already started calling it, the IMBA of this patch. To be honest, I think the developers went too far with the buffs. This is another faction they decided to bring up, but in this case, it's simply too much. The only change I actually find interesting is the split of the uncommon valor uh, upgrade between tier 1 and tier 2. That seems like a reasonable idea. Um, Everything else is either reverting changes from previous patches or an unsuccessful attempt to bring the Marauder Bomber back into the meta. After this patch, everyone suddenly wanted to play this faction. It became incredibly popular. Before the patch, I never had any real problems facing the Imperial Guard as a Necrons. Now they have an army that just feels unkillable. But there are reasons for that, and it's not just because Imperial Guard got buffed. This faction received buffs at very single stage of the game, tier 1, tier 2, 3. Right now, it's absolutely overpowered. Finally, let's talk about the Necrons. Obviously, I'm going to spend more time on this faction because I know it much better and have more to say about it. The first change is absolute disaster. A 10% reduction to low buildings damage of units that were the worst in the game at dealing with this type of armor. Seriously, I honestly thought that one day they would increase this damage so Necrons could at least trade bases a little better. Instead, they nerf it even further. Maybe this will come as a surprise for the uh, for some people, but even before this patch, Necrons could never realistically trade base for base. Now it's even more impossible. The moment you see your opponent committing their entire army to your base, you have to already be nearby within Necron Lord and have teleport ready on your Necron warriors. Otherwise, it's basically GG. Once your generators are destroyed, you will never rebuild them in a time. It takes far too long, and with such a slow army, there is very little you can do about it, especially when your units are already bad at destroying buildings. I honestly don't know what's the genius came up with this change, but it's a complete disaster. Next, we have the three upgrades that used to be split into two. The first two are weaker than the old version, which is understandable, but together they still provide a decent cumulative bonus. Uh, 7% and 5%, also 10% to low building. My suggestion would be to restore the original damage against low buildings, also damage of the first two upgrades, then reduce the third upgrade to 20%, taking into account the health nerfs and the other balance changes. Yes, the third upgrade gives you more overall impact when combined with the previous two, but realistically, that barely matters. Most games won't even reach that point. By then, you will probably have already lost your army, or your army will be too weak, or your economy will have collapsed. You will be forced to sacrifice something long before that third upgrade becomes relevant. Because of these brilliant balance changes, Necrons have become practically unplayable. I don't recommend playing this faction until another patch comes out. Personally, I probably won't be playing them either, except in the tournament I'm already participating in. Outside of that, I honestly don't see why should I. Um, Blade once received a nerf, but it didn't actually solve the problem. You can still spam them just as easily because their build time didn't change. Yes, they're slightly more expensive, but in a practice, people use them exactly the same way as before. Personally, I would increase their build time from 36 to 44 seconds while keeping the cost per model at 30. Um, Immortals now deal less damage to low vehicles, which is acceptable overall because vehicles were also nerfed. The exception is the Sentinel, and now that's honestly becoming a problem, especially since Imperial Guard as the whole uh, became much stronger. Still, compared to the first two fixes, this is relatively minor issue. Uh, Parties receive a faster reinforcement speed. Honestly, this buff was completely unnecessary. Their reinforcement rate was already perfectly fine, and this change hasn't really affected anything. It's similar to the previous patch when Immortals received 50 extra hit points for no real reason, and it certainly doesn't compensate for the catastrophic changes that came before it. Uh, One positive change was the attack scarab. They can now genuinely serve as a scouts. That said, I still don't think they will ever become a reliable anti-air unit. They require far too much micro to stop them from accidentally flying into the enemy base and getting wiped out. On top of that, they can't even catch most aircraft because they're slower and attack scarabs. And since they have to fight in the melee, it's extremely difficult for them to function as anti-air. Uh, at least now they finally have a clear scouting role, and you can also use them to absorb some damage. Um, the last balance change was actually very good. Lord Destroy could, at least in theory, disable one or two enemy squads for the whole game. Um, in practice, that was difficult to pull off consistently, uh, even though I don't think this kind of mechanic should exist in the first place. So reducing the duration from 30 seconds to 20 seconds seems uh, completely fine. Um, Personally, I think Necron Warriors need their build time reduced from 30 seconds to 22 seconds, with the rest scaling according the game's existing build time formula. Uh, Tier 3 artifacts are also incredibly expensive, also providing almost the same impact as the Tier 1 artifacts. And that's pretty much everything I wanted to say about the Necrons. As for the Orks, there honestly isn't much to say because there were very few changes. Uh, I think the Orks were already handled very well in the previous patch. Once again, whoever was responsible for balancing this faction did an excellent job. They identified the actual problematic units, and the changes they made were exactly what the game needed. More importantly, those changes actually work. I think it's pretty obvious that very few people are going to complain about this set of orcs balance changes in this patch. The only adjustment that may have gone a little too far is the fighter bomber. Other than that, everything else looks solid. So, unfortunately, there is not much more to say about the orcs. Now, let's talk about the Sister of the Battle. Overall, most of the changes are actually pretty good. Where the faction needed buffs, it got buffs. Where it needed nerfs, it got nerfs. The problem is that the biggest and most important issues weren't addressed at all. Against this faction, it's practically impossible to build vehicles, and it always has been. It's basically suicide. trying to trade bases with them isn't an option either. Their grenades will burn down both your base and your vehicles, and on top of that, they have Celestians, which are an absolute nightmare. A lot of players who used to complain that Sister of the Battle were weak simply didn't understand how to use the faction properly. They weren't taking advantages of its strengths, and that's why they were losing. But after the previous patch, things changed. On top of that, their already incredibly powerful ability to melt vehicles and destroy buildings in seconds, they also gained very respectable anti-infantry capabilities. As a result, Necrons can no longer push them, fight them head on, or even trade bases with them. So, what are you supposed to do? Not build vehicles, not build buildings. That's just nonsense. Even before these changes, Sister of the Battle could already fight Necrons very effectively, especially once the Confessor gave them 15% damage bonus. Um, Now it's honestly becoming ridiculous. With Dark Eldar, developers slightly reduced their anti-infantry power while giving them a bit more anti-vehicle strain. Here, though, it's the exact opposite. It's a complete balance disaster whether I'm playing Dark Eldar or Necrons. The last faction I want to see in a multiplayer is the Sister of the Battle. As for the Space Marines, their damage against buildings was reduced, mainly affected melta bombs and the orbital bombardment. As for the first one, I'm not convinced that a 15% reduction is enough. For orbital bombardment, though, I think 30% is reasonable. Then we have buffs to the chaplain along with the several other general buffs. Some of these also apply to chaos, such as the changes of Terminator's teleportation. Honestly, after looking at all of this, I only have one question. Now that you've buffed this faction, when are you going to start addressing the mechanics that are actually problematic? The first two changes we discussed are good, but they're insignificant compared to the number of buffs Space Marines received across their standard infantry roster. Um, I'd really like the developers to take a look at scouts. They deal enormous damage to workers. They're extremely effective at killing scarabs, and they make it incredibly difficult for Necrons to control the map. I'd also like them to look at the combination of the Librarian and the Great Knights. Once they hit your army with their smite, while supporting them with the range firepower, they can practically raise a Necron army from the game. Under the old balance, this issue were less noticeable because the faction struggled overall, but that doesn't mean those mechanics weren't already extremely powerful. Just because the faction wasn't performing well doesn't mean it didn't have some incredibly strong tools. I genuinely want to talk about the real balance problems in this game, and I hope other players will do the same from the perspective of their own factions. I'm all for that. Now, let's move on to the Tau, my favorite faction. They're still most broken and overpowered faction in the game, and I'm going to be very direct here because there is a lot to talk about. I will start with the West Pit. This unit destroy buildings incredibly fast. You simply don't have enough time to repair them. If they find one of your generators, it's almost 100% guaranteed to go down, and there's very little you can do about it. Unlike Necrons, Dark Eldar can at least hide some of their buildings around the map and hope they don't get found. Uh, Other fractions have their own ways to defend generators. Orcs, for example, don't require much micro because all their buildings shoot back and eventually they also get minus. Necrons, on the other hand, are forced to stay in their base or leave at least one squad of Necron warriors behind while also upgrading the obelisk. All of that demands an enormous amount of attention. As long as west bits are on the maps, uh, you are basically playing a nightmare. That's the first problem. The second problem is that the Tau can safely secure the entire half of the map using invisible stealth suits with the gem packs. They can simply build a Tau commander in the tier 1 and spam fire warriors for as long as they want. It doesn't matter whether you try to rush to tier 2 or commit to a tier 1 push. Uh, they just upgrade their listening posts to LP2s, which, by the way, were buffed by another 10%. I honestly don't know who thought that was a good idea. For Elder buffing LP2 made sense because their listening posts were relatively weak. Tau are completely different. They don't have turrets, and that's why a standard LP2 already deals excellent damage. But that's not even the biggest problem. The real issue is the fire warriors. They can see almost everything while sitting safely inside their own base. Their vision limit of 15 barely matters because they simply melt anything that enters their firing range and vision. With that amount of firepower supported by the Tau commander, they can even push forward in the tier 1. The Tau commander provides vision, the fire warriors provide overwhelming damage, and suddenly they're the ones applying pressure. Trying to close the distance against that army is almost impossible playing as an Necron. Their damage feels like getting kicked by a horse, and that's before all of their upgrades even come online. But by tier 2, even their minor vision limitations practically disappears. I've seen two reasonable ways to solve this problem. Either reduce their firing range or reduce their vision. Thankfully, the developers seem to have recognized the issue, but they address it very cautiously. They reduce maximum firing range from 50 to 45. In reality, though, that affects only tier 3 gameplay. You will already be struggling against 40 in the tier 2 and 35 in the tier 1, so this change just doesn't really solve the problem. It just slightly reduces Tao's pressure in the late game. The truth is, you probably won't even survive long enough to reach tier 3 against Tao player who actually knows what they are doing and understands when to attack and when to play defensively. Personally, if the developers are going to rebalance their range at all, I'd go much further. 30 range in the tier 1, 35 in the tier 2, and 40 in the tier 3. Overall, there are few generally good balance changes in this patch that deserve credit, but they don't solve the fundamental problems with DAO. So, in the end, nothing has really changed. Well, after this patch, Necrons can realistically compete only against themselves. Uh, Maybe they still have around a 45-55 matchup against Dark Eldar and Orks with the advantage going to the later. And that's assuming the automatch gives you maps with an average number of strategic points and the non-Necron faction doesn't end up with 20% more resources than normal. which, in my opinion, shouldn't be happening in the first place. That's what actually matters, not things like slug deposits. There are still a lot of stereotypes in this game. People say things like Necrons beat Tau, or if a map has slug deposit, it's automatically a Necron map. If that's really true, then why do Necron players consistently choose battle marshes instead of meeting of minds? Also, the game hasn't stood still. Even under the old balance, the meta kept involving players who were considered top level 10 or even 5 years ago would probably be average players today if they relied only on the knowledge they had back then. Overall, this patch contains a lot of genuinely good changes, but it also includes a few absolutely catastrophic ones that pushes the game backwards instead of forwards. More importantly, the biggest balance issue across most factions weren't addressed at all, so I will probably be switching to Dark Eldar for a while, or maybe I will just spend some time playing other games like Battle Sector. Anyway, that's all for me. Take care, don't be sad, and wherever you do, don't play Necrons. See you next time.